Hello. In this video, we're going to look at investigating data. So when we study data, we loosely follow a process called the data cycle. All right, so the data cycle is made up of 4 steps. The first step, we go through and we ask questions. Second step, we consider data, specifically in favor of answering those questions. Third step, analyze the data. And the fourth step, we interpret the data. And the process does loosely follow the steps that we just, the order that I just described them. Typically start off by asking questions, but in some cases, you may have the data first, and the data may then inspire the questions that you ask because that's the only data set that you have. All right, so you might be considering a problem to research, and then the data may be presented first before you can ask the questions. So the idea behind this cycle is that it revolves around researching a topic. So the goal is to go through and research a topic. So example topics that you might research could include things like what makes a runner faster or slower in the LA marathon. That's what we're going to look at. We're going to use 4 examples throughout today's lecture. Other examples, that are a little bit bigger topics. So what effect do taxes have on the economy? Or another example, does human activity contribute to global warming? So these are all just examples of research topics. So you might want to go through and research one of these, and then you would use the cycle here to go through and perform the research. Okay, so just again to kind of highlight it, let's say if you had the research topic first, like for example, what effect do taxes have on the economy? If you started off with that, you probably would ask questions first, then you try and go through and find data that is relevant to taxes and their effect on the economy. Once you have that data, you then analyze it, and then you would interpret the results of your analysis. And then at that point, you might either say, okay, I'm done. I can answer the topic that I researched, or you jump over and you start asking, and you ask more questions. You say, well, the results of this round of the cycle inspired more questions. So let's go ahead and ask those, see if we can find data that answers those questions, and you just continue around the cycle until you feel that you have successfully researched the topic. Okay. And same thing goes for global warming. This in the case of like the LA Marathon example that we're going to look at, we're going to start off with the data, and so because you're going to start off with the data, you would probably want to you start here and then you kind of jump back to ask questions about the data set that you have, and then you'd probably jump to analysis. So it's the cycle is not strictly followed. It's just more of a inspiration for the process that you go through to study. Okay, so let's go through and take a look at each one of these discrete steps. So the first one is to ask questions. So the goal when we're going through and asking questions is we want to ask questions that could be answered by data and that are relevant to the research topic. So what we're looking for is, the goal is to ask questions that could be answered by data and that address the research topic. So suppose you're interested in, so we're going to do our LA Marathon here. So suppose you're interested in studying the qualities associated with running a fast LA Marathon. So what are some initial ideas that you'd have for research? Some quick examples that I was able to come up with just thinking about it is, what about how you run the marathon? So is it better to get off to a fast start and then slow down as the race progresses? Is it better to run at a consistent pace? So one thing we could look at in terms of studying LA marathon performance is we could look at the splits, for how you run each portion of the race, and then, study the, study the distribution there, like how those differ. Okay, so we could look at the way in which the runner runs the race. Okay, so this could be better fast start, then slow down. Versus running at a more consistent pace. What other qualities would make for a fast LA marathon time? The other thing that I thought about is the characteristics of the runner. So what characteristics might be relevant? Age, weight, so typically you see marathon runners and they're usually very, very thin. And so maybe more weight is not advantageous. So if you're very muscular, it might make it more difficult to go through and run the marathon. Now, as I mentioned, in this case, we actually have data. So let's take a look at that data. So here we have some data that was collected by the LA Marathon itself when they ran the event. And so we can kind of take a look and compare that to some of the thoughts that we had, the questions that we had. So we could see we do have age. Unfortunately, they did not collect information on weight. So we couldn't go through and use that as a factor. We do have some splits here. The time it took to run 5K, the time it took to run 15K. And then we have some measurements for total time, clock time, net time. Not sure what the difference is between those two. That would be something that you'd want to go through and take a look at, determine whether that one is preferable. Hometown, I guess you could try and with hometown on the data, maybe you could look at where people are from to determine their performance and whether that's relevant. We do have gender, so we could look at gender to see whether that matters in terms of your total time. But the data set itself. So if you don't have a data set, and you're going to go through and you're going to ask a bunch of questions, and then you're going to try and find a data set that answers those. But you might not be able to find good data. That actually is a common problem in going through and analyzing research topics. And so you might have to depend upon, the data the only data that's supplied, which in this case is this information. And then from there, you're going to have to tailor your questions to the information that you have. Okay. So anyway, that's the first step, is to go through and ask some questions. Let's look at the next step. The second step is to consider the data, or consider data. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for data that will answer the questions that we just asked. So when we are considering data sets, we're going to ask some questions about those data sets. So yes, we're going to ask a few questions about the data set that we are using to answer the questions that we just came up with. Sounds complicated. All right. So anyway, so the first question we're going to look at: who or what was observed? All right. So in the case of the LA Marathon, the answer would be the marathon runners, right? So we just want to make sure that we understand the data. That's the point of these questions, is that you understand the data, because the data itself could be problematic in various ways. Okay, so so you want to make sure that you understand who or what was observed when the data was collected. You want to understand the variables, what variables were collected. And how were they measured? So to stick with our LA example, LA Marathon example, age is in the data set. Was the age checked against an ID? Was the age offered by the runner? So because there could be important differences there. People might not be honest about their ages. I'm not sure why they wouldn't be, but just hypothetically, they might not be. And so you do want to take a look at, what information was collected, what variables were collected, and how were they measured. That is, those two things are really important. Because if you go through and you use age as an important factor, and it turns out the age was not measured against like an identification of some kind, then your results could be flawed. And then finally, sticking with variables here, what were the units? And that's, again, just mainly to understand the data that's collected. Who collected the data? And why could that be important? So in our example with the LA Marathon, I can't think of a reason why anyone would be biased who was collecting the data. However, in studying other things, like the example, the climate change, the global warming example, there are politics involved. And so the person who collected the data might matter. Okay, you might be concerned about, potential bias in how they collected the data, the methods that were used. And so again, the point is you just want to make sure that you understand the data and everything around it before you spend a lot of time and effort analyzing it. You want to make sure that it's good data and that there's not problems with it for various reasons. How did they collect the data? I kind of got into that earlier, where if we'd had weight on the LA Marathon, did they have a scale there where they weighed people, or again, did they just take people's word at it? If that's going to be an important factor in performance, then you really do need that to be measured at the event. Why did they collect the data? So again, why might that matter? Again, I can't, in the LA Marathon example, I can't imagine why that would matter. But again, to go back to our example where there's politics involved, why someone collected the data is an important consideration if there are politics involved. When did they collect the data? Okay, so for the LA Marathon example, you could argue that if they collected the data in, say, the 1970s, then that was a long time ago. And so training regimens, nutrition, a variety of different things have changed in the last, 50 years. Wow, 50 years. It's really been 50 years since the 1970s. That's crazy. And so when they collected the data might make a difference in terms of going through and performing, in terms of producing an outcome that would be useful. If you had really old data and then you went through and said, we have solved why people run the LA Marathon quickly, and then you produce your results and it's based upon data from the 1970s, are people going to, are they going to shoot a bunch of holes in your research because you use data from so long ago? Where did they collect the data? Well, in the LA Marathon example, it's pretty obvious where that was, but where could be relevant if you want to go through and, let's say, you're trying to perform some research in terms of like opinion polls. And you go through and you collect research on a topic in, again, a political topic. You collect research in California, or you collect research in, I don't know, Texas or something. Then the results could vary greatly by where the data was collected. So again, this is all just about understanding your data thoroughly before you go through and analyze it and base the results of your research on it. Oh, and then I did write this down. In this case, the data from the LA Marathon that I showed, it came from a website if you want to see more of that data. So if you're really excited to see a lot of LA Marathon data, then the LA Marathon data is at www.laymarathon.com/race-week-end /results. I have not checked whether the data is still there, but the textbook that I'm using claims that it was there at least once upon a time. Okay, next, we're going to analyze the data. Once we are satisfied that we thoroughly understand our data, we think it will work for answering our questions. The next step is to analyze the data. And so we're not going to go into a lot of depth about analyzing data, because that's what you're learning in this course, is how to go through and analyze data. And we haven't covered any methods yet. That's what we're going to spend the entire semester doing. Okay, so analyzing data is what you're going to be learning to do in this course. The first method that we're going to look at in the next chapter is to visualize the data. So if you can clearly see the data, that usually can inspire some results. So we're going to come up with a variety of different ways to go through and visualize the data because of that. Okay, and then finally, once you're through analyzing the data, you're going to interpret the data. So what we mean by interpret the data is you're going to look at the results of your analysis, and you're going to try and answer your questions. Now, I want to be clear here. So the goal is to answer the questions that we posed in the first step of the process here. The goal is not, well, the goal is to resolve the research topic, but in interpreting the data, it is certainly permissible after you go through and do one cycle that you may not feel that you've thoroughly researched the topic. And so then you want to, after you're done interpreting the data, you want to ask more questions, consider more data, then analyze that data, and just keep going through this cycle until you have completed your research. All right, so once you interpret data, you're going to answer the questions using the results from analyzing the data, then potentially propose more questions. Okay, so that gives us a loose framework for going through and researching topics. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.